Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Teresa, and I'm the Office and Events Coordinator for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. I'll be moderating today's seminar. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held live on Portland State University's urban campus, in addition to being broadcast. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's will be hosted fully online. Today, we're pleased to have Aaron Golub present his and John MacArthur's research on understanding technology-based exclusion in emerging smart mobility systems. Aaron is professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University, and John MacArthur is our sustainable transportation program manager here at TREC. Before jumping into the seminar, I'd like to let you know that our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, June 2nd. It is a National Institute for Transportation and Communities webinar, during which Jennifer Dill and Nathan McNeil will share their findings from 15 years of travel surveys at Portland area transit-oriented developments. You can view that and our other upcoming events at trec.pdx.edu/events. As an overview of our seminar today, you can expect Aaron to present for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A with him and John. I will be receiving questions through the questions pane on your control panel, and I'll save them to the end to ask them of Aaron. If we run out of time for all your questions, we'll give John and Aaron the opportunity to email written responses to any questions left unanswered. We will be recording today's webinar, and it will be available on our website later today along with the presentation slides. And lastly, if you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. And with that, I'll be turning it over to Aaron.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Let me just share my screen. Welcome everyone from my second bedroom in Southeast Portland. Not our typical setup. Is my screen showing properly?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
Looks good.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Aaron Golub. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Urban Studies and Planning. And my co-PI, John MacArthur, is kind of helping with the Q&A if there are any, and he'll be chiming in if there are any questions related to some of the parts of the project he worked on. I'm just going to go through. I've got a series of slides, and feel free to post any questions in the chat and stop me at any moment if there are clarifying questions. And of course, we've left some time at the end for Q&A. So I'll be just discussing a research project we have going here, focused on understanding technology-based exclusion in emerging smart mobility systems, where we're focusing in this project on transit payment systems, but I think some of the lessons and the issues uncovered pertain to a lot of different kinds of mobility systems. Let me just introduce my team. I already introduced myself. Ann Brown is an assistant professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management down at U of O. Candace Brakewood is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering over at UT Knoxville. And John I introduced. And we also had a large group of graduate students and undergraduate students help with a lot of our work on this project. So just to motivate ourselves, there is this growing dilemma of public transportation providers writ large, whether they're transit or TNCs, these are providing public services. Increasingly move to payment, reservation, information, trip planning and first and last mile connectivity systems, which require travelers to have access to private internet, smartphone, and banking systems. And this poses a real dilemma. For a long time, we just took it for granted that a public service, you could show up and use that on your own. And that's still the case, and you can pay cash on board for many services. But increasingly, that may not be the case in the coming decade. And as we're seeing, for example, under the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of systems remove their cash acceptance, and that has posed problems for certain riders. So we ask in this project, what steps can be taken to ensure universal access to these innovations that increasingly require access to private services? Oh, let me go back. So this is a multi-agency funded project. It's part of our pooled funding program at the Research Center, where external agencies and groups can pool their funds and propose a project, and then it's matched by funds from our Research Center. And then the Research Center administers the RFP, and then different research teams can bid on the project. And so this one was a pooled fund from the city of Eugene, Oregon, the city of Gresham, Oregon, Lane Transit District, which is the transit provider for Eugene, Oregon, Clever Consulting Group out of Portland, RTD Denver, and our Research Center. So motivating this project, as I said, payment technologies are rapidly evolving. Many transit agencies are adopting new automated payment technologies, which will replace cash, if not completely eliminate it over the coming decade. These, of course, are designed to smooth operations and improve convenience. But we ask, what about those who cannot or have not adopted these new payment technologies? And the project, in the end, is trying to answer, are there reasonable equity mitigations, and how costly and effective are those mitigations? And we're going to focus a little bit today on the first part of our project, which is really inventorying what are those equity challenges. And later in the project, which is not complete as of today, we will be getting into these questions about how effective are the workarounds and other mitigations that agencies are using. So what I want to do is spend a little time going over the substantial existing research on disparities in these automated and online and connected to credit card systems, because there's a lot of work on this more generally, and so some of it is interesting to review. Of course, a lot of this is from broader survey work, like all households, and then the work I'll be presenting from our research is just from transit riders. So, of course, many of you have heard of the term banking divide or digital divide, and these are these concepts around disparities in access to some of these services. So, for example, if we look at just banking services, credit and savings accounts, we do see some disparities by age in households. Older populations have better access. Income, as we'd expect, higher income, better access. By race and ethnicity, white households have higher access to banking resources. And overall, it's 87% of households use some formal banking, and 67% are fully banked, meaning they're not using any informal services at all. They're only relying on formal services. So there's some question around the definitions, but if you're using some informal services like check cashing, title loans, I think maybe debit cards or prepaid cards counts, then you're not considered fully banked, and because those systems often charge they charge higher fees and are worse terms for the user. From the credit side, not surprisingly, the young And very old have lower access to credit in terms of credit card use. Higher income, better access. And for race and ethnicity, white and Asian households have higher access. But across the board, overall, it's around 80% have access to some credit. But that would pose a problem when we look closer at transit if they're overrepresented in the households not having access. The digital divide is well understood as well. If we look at smartphone ownership, interestingly, there's a disparity by age where younger folks have higher smartphone access, higher incomes, higher access. And there's some mixed results in terms of race and ethnicity, depending on the survey. So I often look, there's an FDIC survey on the use of new technologies, and there's a Pew series of surveys on the same subject. And there, those results are slightly different. But in general, they're fairly close in terms of the rates for the different race and ethnic groups. So that's interesting. Some recent work is about 72% have access to smartphones, and I think it's a little bit higher now. Looking at cell service, here we're interested in whether individuals would have access to reasonable, dependable cell data access, because if they're needing to use these systems to access stored fares or make reservations for last mile connections or activate an e-shuttle, e-scooter, then cell service is important. And interestingly, when you look at cell service quality and access, there are some interesting disparities. So, for example, younger smartphone users are more likely to let their service lapse due to cost of service or data limits. Low-income households are twice as likely as average to let service lapse. And African Americans and Hispanics are also much more likely to let service lapse. And overall, it's about a quarter of smartphone users let cell service lapse. So if we look at internet access at home, which would also be important in terms of making reservations or understanding schedules or trip planning, here it's very high access to internet at home, but there are some disparities. So yeah, the FDIC and Pew studies have slightly different results. So you can see high access to internet for older folks over 55, although tapering off in the FDIC study, whereas the Pew has higher access in general for those over 50. Higher income, not surprisingly, better access. And then we see disparities by race and by race and ethnicity. Here, African Americans are shown to have lower access and Asian households higher. But overall, again, these two survey instruments, survey series, FDIC has high access, and Pew show that 90% have some form of broadband. And so there might be a slight difference in definition there. And then who is using some of these new mobility tools? And this is not really related to our look at digital divide, but these are kind of the results of digital divide, but also locational issues. When we look more at this second row that I'm focused on here, this row on use of new mobility services, of course, you would expect, like transportation network companies, TNCs, Uber and Lyft and others, you'd have a higher use among younger folks who are more knowledgeable about these systems, more versed in some of these new patterns of travel. So there's some other results by income. This is a TRB review. It's a little bit outdated, but has higher use of TNCs among higher income. although work in San Francisco by folks at Berkeley showed that it was moderate income were the highest users, and then work out of Boston showed that the users of TNCs were actually fairly similar in income to the rest of the region. And then Anne Brown's work looked at use by race and ethnicity down in LA. And so that showed higher frequency among racial and ethnic minorities. Although a national review of a lot of different systems, I don't remember how many, like 20 or 30 cities, I believe, showed that it was inconclusive when looking at trips generated by neighborhood. So that was interesting. But overall, I mean, when we look at new mobility, we're talking about just a small fraction of all trips. So some of the disparities are really among a very small number of trips. Okay, so let me just transition back to our project here. Our main research questions are, what are the prevalence and types of automated fare systems being deployed across the US? So just inventorying new payment systems focused on transit. How do these automated payment systems impact or exclude different riders? And so that's what I'll be presenting today. Looking at demographics, geography, where folks live, technology barriers, smartphone access, internet access, banking and credit barriers, thinking about banking as underbanked or not access to the full suite of services. And then language and technological proficiency comes into this. And so we get into people's comfort level with paying online or through phones. Significant number are not comfortable doing that. And then what mitigation strategies have agencies adopted? And then how cost effective are they from an agency and a rider point of view in terms of convenience and cost? Today, I'm just going to present on this middle part of our project. So this project is still being worked on. We're completing it later this year. So for this part of the project, we're working, working with the donors to the pooled fund. Portland, Gresham, sorry, I don't list Gresham here, but we worked heavily in Gresham, Denver, and Eugene as our case studies. We do 2 focus groups in East Portland, Gresham, and 1 in Eugene. And then we do a larger sample survey in the 3 metro areas. So our case cities, just a quick overview. Eugene, Oregon, the Lane County Transit District is about 300,000 in their service district. They have about 10 million boardings a year. They are a bus BRT based system. The Denver RTD is the largest metro area we're working in, at close to 3 million in their service area and over 100 million boardings a year. It's also a heavy bus system with a substantial light rail system, for those of you who know it. And then TriMet, the Portland Gresham area where we're working here, is much smaller than Denver at about 1.5 million in the service area, but almost as many annual boardings at 100 million, 97 million. And it's a heavy bus system, but a substantial light rail system as well. So our first approach was a series of focus groups. We did 2 focus groups in Gresham, and that was a mixture of low-income transit riders, a mixture of English language proficiency, and age groups mixed into those 2 groups. And then we had the Eugene focus group, a single focus group, low-income and mostly transit-dependent folks. And what was brought up by the discussions helped us to understand some things that I think we weren't quite clear on, but also, of course, helped us design a better large sample survey instrument that I'll go over next. But some of the issues brought up, of course, a lot of it dwelled on affordability, access, scheduling, the dynamics of transit service in general. But then when we kind of got into the technology side and the payment side, there were some real strong feelings around trust. So riders expressed a fear of tracking a fear of losing their smart cards or their phones, and it kind of associating the stored value with a loss of their card or their account. Of course, theft, and then also data privacy was an issue about not trusting the agency or their phone. Can the phone be hacked? And of course, will the agency protect any kind of online accounts that they have with, linked to credit card information? That was a very common theme. One thing that did come up is that people were scared that if their phone ran out of battery, then they couldn't ride the system. And that's, of course, true in a way. And so they kept going back to the durability of cash, that it just is a, durable backup. And so this kind of contrasted with the nature of battery and electric power that people were not sure about, that if the bus, or the ticket vending machine reader didn't work, then they couldn't ride and things like that. And that was common throughout the discussions. In general, of course, we also came up with a lot of discomfort using new payment systems, web-based payment apps, smartphones. And then one thing that we need to recognize is for low-income folks, identity theft can be devastating. And often I think as planners and folks, professionals, where there's certain systems that many of us, have by virtue of having formal access to banking, where identity theft is not as devastating as it can be when you don't have access to some of those systems that can kind of restore bank account value and things like that. So we need to understand that this is a substantial issue for a lot of transit riders. Next, I think that there was an interesting discussion around how fare media and the policies worked in terms of, for example, how a day pass works, especially with the issue of fare capping, which many agencies are using now with smart media, where if you pay for 2 rides, it converts automatically to a day pass, and then from then on, you're not paying anymore. I think people were not realizing how the fare systems were working, and many were actually avoiding trips because they misunderstood that at that point they had a day pass, which is unfortunate. So a lot of our discussion was spent going over how the media work, how the policies work. And then, of course, what came up a lot was lack of access to data and internet. So many are relying on public Wi-Fi, don't have internet at home or at work, limited data plans. And this brings up the next point, was this diverse use of smartphones. Some were not using data on their smartphones at all. On the other hand, smartphones for many people, not surprisingly, are their only internet connected devices. They do not have home computers. Many just rely on the smartphone to do any kind of internet access that normally would have been done, maybe earlier in the last decade on a computer, on a home computer. And then finally, I already mentioned this, but really many were lamenting the loss of cash as this backup, or for tourists or for people who really depend on cash, people doing bottle recycling and things like that. So that's came up a lot, and it's going to be difficult to move beyond cash for many people. So let me move to the large sample survey. We did short intercept surveys. They're a few minutes each at transit stops in Portland, Gresham, Eugene, and Denver in late last summer. And we ended up with about 2,300 surveys between the 3 cities. And what I'm going to do is go through the results of the overall survey, but then really dive into these comparisons between groups to understand some of the equity issues and disparities, especially along issues of age, race, ethnicity, and income. So I'm going to talk about millennials. Those are those under 35 years old. Gen X as 35 to 55, and baby boomers, I'll just abbreviate them as boomers, as those over 55 years old. For race and ethnicity, we did an analysis. Because the sample size was not so great, we just decided to kind of group riders into two groups: non-Hispanic white or riders of color. And non-Hispanic whites explicitly selected non-Hispanic, and they selected white for their race, or they skipped the Hispanic question, but they selected white for their race. That qualified them as non-Hispanic whites. If they didn't respond to either the ethnicity question or the race question, they were classified as missing. And then riders of color selected Hispanic and or any other race other than white. And I think these are fairly standard ways to classify these groups. Finally, low-income riders were those with incomes below $50,000 per year, which is roughly, it's below the area median incomes for the three regions. So let me just go over a little bit of the sample, and now I'm just going to show a series of tables, and I'll try to go through them slowly, just to let everyone digest all this information. But the three columns here in the center are the three case cities, and then what we've done is on this right column, we've reweighted all the samples and combined them, reweighted them based on their the transit system ridership, annual boardings, and then reweighted each individual response, and then came up with a kind of a composite profile, as if the 2,300 surveys from the three agencies, three metro areas, represent a kind of composite transit rider from these middle-sized metro and small metro. I would never say that this profile would approximate anything like a New York or Chicago rider, but I think for a large number of the middle-sized metros, these numbers are probably pretty representative or relevant at least. So I'm going to show results for the three cities, and then I'm going to show the composite results alongside for the following tables. So let me just go through some of this. This is the breakdown of our race and ethnicity for the three cities, and you can see the composite. A healthy representation of riders of color, other than in Eugene, which may not have the same demographics as the two other major metros. But we can see from the composite of the three cities that it's a fairly good split. About 13% of our riders did not answer these demographic questions, which is to be expected. For our age group, we also had a fairly good split. Boomers were slightly smaller as a group than the others. And we see on the composite, boomers were only 15%, whereas we had a good representation from Gen X and a large group of millennials. And a sizable group did not answer the age question. A similar profile for the composite you can see in the other three cities. For income, we did have a problem with folks not answering this question, not surprising, but it was about 40% of our sample did not answer the question. But still, we had a large group of low-income folks and a reasonable sized group of high-income folks. And I have not done the analysis to try and figure out, are the missing folks more likely low income and high income by triangulating some of the other dimensions. I think I can guess, you can kind of see some patterns among the missing group when you look at some of the data, but it's not a huge deal. We still have a nice sample from the other groups, but we can see general overrepresentation of low income, which is not surprising. This is transit, which typically has a large number of transit dependent folks who are lower income. This is the original survey breakdown, which I'm not going to go through, but you can see the large numbers of these bottom income groups. And then finally, gender, which we do not do an equity analysis of, but we have some interesting information. And we can see there's a fairly good split. I mean, there's mostly, you can see male defined as about half the sample, and then a good number did not answer the question. And then female at about 36%. And the same general relationship holds across the 3 cities. So let me go into some of the equity, let me go into some of the results. So first, what I want to do is I'm going to present 2 tables for each of our analyses. The first table is just a general inventory of payment approaches. How are people paying for their fares? And then I'm going to show a table looking at some of the dimensions of exclusion. And so here is just the overall results for the 3 cities and the composite ridership. So I'm not doing any comparisons yet on race, ethnicity, income, or age, and I'll get to those later. So I'm going to go slow because there's a lot of information. These are the payment practices currently. We wanted to get a sense for how are people paying with the systems currently available. And then we ask in the exclusion part, how would they pay if cash were to be eliminated? Cash on board were to be eliminated. And so we can see there's some differences here, and these are of course differences in the way that different employers provide passes. In Eugene, apparently there's a large number of these might be related to the role of the university in the city, University of Oregon. But we can see here, so I've kind of marked blue as high, large numbers, and red as low, so you can just kind of glance. A lot of people are paying cash on board, or what I'll refer to as cash on board. Here I've written cash on bus. And this was surprising, but this is still a major activity. We look at cash at ticket vending machines is also still a major activity among even the 3 cities and our overall composite rider. Cash at retail and at agency offices is lower. But when we move into some of the automated systems, the Apple Pay, Android Pay, which are not available in Denver, Eugene, at least at the time of the survey, it's fairly low in Gresham where it's available. Then when we look at the using credit and debit at ticket vending machines or smartphone apps, which are of course linked to credit and debit, and then credit and debit at retail or agency offices, it's much lower than the cash in general. So that was surprising. Fairly high in Gresham. TriMet has had the smartphone Hop app for several years. And so I think that just the amount of time has brought up those numbers. That was interesting. So let me look at some of the dimensions of exclusion. And here I have kind of colored red as potential problems for exclusion, meaning higher exclusion or likelihood of exclusion. When I'm referring to exclusion, I'm referring to as we transition to more and more automated systems and possibly cash on board is eliminated, where cash may be usable at some ticket vending machines, but that also may be phased out over the next decade. Who would most likely be harmed? And that's what I've labeled here in red. In the greener the color, and yellow is more neutral, the greener the color, the less someone would be affected by the transition, or actually the more they would be operating comfortably under new automated payment technologies. So if you kind of squint your eyes, you can see that Eugene has a much higher rate of potential exclusion riders in Eugene than the other 2 cities. Well, let me just first look at the composite rider and go through some of these dimensions here. So this top group of questions is around share of riders lacking access to traditional banking and internet. So the top group is the share of riders that are unbanked. They have no savings, checking, credit, or debit accounts at all. They lack a smartphone, share lacking smartphone, share having no internet access, then the share having only Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi as their internet access. And so for the composite rider, this last category is a concern where a good share, 29%, are relying on public Wi-Fi, libraries, cafes, for their internet access. And so if they're, trying to do trip planning or things from their home, it might be inconvenient. On the other hand, our rate of internet access is quite high across the board, and a little bit higher, I think, than the general public, which is interesting. Smartphone access actually is quite good, and I think better than what surveys show for the general public. This is 87% smartphone use, which is very high. And banking access, I think this is similar to the general public with 86% banked, fully banked. I think that might be actually a bit higher, but we can see that it's fairly steady across the 3 cities. Great, and I'm not seeing any chats coming through, and I know that John is helping with that, so I'm just going to keep going. This is a lot of information, but I know we'll have some time for question and answer in a moment. Next area of exclusion is phone data limitations. We asked 2 types of questions. Do they use data on their phone at all? And then are they concerned about data limitations of their cell phone plans? And there was a fairly high level of concern for their plans, and most people are using data on their phone, but still we were surprised that it was this many, over 10% of users of smartphones are not using internet on their phones. They're only using the phone features, which did come up in the focus groups, but this was just more than we were expecting. And then we asked, how comfortable are they using some of these automated payment systems, like paying on the website, loading financial information on a recurring website profile or account. So that's different. So we have a one-time payment versus a recurring payment. And then we asked about loading financial information on your smartphone, linking your app to credit. And then finally, purchasing by phone or over the phone to an agency correspondent, and that actually was not very popular at all. But we can look at the comfort. People were marginally more comfortable with paying on a website one time where their information would not be stored. But when it came to storing their information, they were relatively uncomfortable. You can see about a third of folks are just uncomfortable with those kind of, keeping financial information in a profile somewhere on the internet or on their phone. And then finally, we asked, in this future, if cash on board were to be eliminated, they were only able to use cash at ticket vending machines or at retail to load value or purchase some kind of passes, then what would they do? And we were wondering if people would be able to move to some of the credit and debit options, online, phone, or using them at ticket vending machines, or would they still want to use cash at ticket vending machines or at retail? And then would some just claim that they could not ride at all? So this is actually a share of those who are currently paying cash on board. It's not a share of all transit riders. And the cash on board, if you recall, are about 30%. And so that you would multiply this by 30% to get an actual impact on overall ridership. But a significant number claimed that they would be able to switch, which is what we were hoping to see. But a very large number would remain with cash, and that was interesting to us. Like in Eugene, it was nearly 2/3 are going to go to ticket vending machine with cash. Would not try to use any kind of phone-based app or anything. And then unable to ride, fairly large number were claiming that they would not be able to ride anymore if cash on board were not accepted. So hopefully everyone's comfortable with these kind of dimensions of exclusion. And I'm going to go through now the same table, this inventory of payment, and then the dimensions of exclusion for our different equity analyses. Great. So looking at the income disparities, And this is, again, the inventory of current payment practices. I think if it's easier, we just look at the composite analysis. And you can kind of see that there's a high income group is more likely to have employer-based passes, more likely to use the smartphone apps for fare payment, and slightly more likely to be using the credit options, credit ticket vending machines, and then less likely to be using the cash options than our low-income respondents, pretty significantly less when we compare those. Our missing group is kind of a mixture, and it was a little bit hard to figure out. But yeah, I think if we compare these groups, we can kind of see there are some clear income disparities, especially around the use of cash, that should be alarming in this transition, kind of mean that we need to do something to reach those folks. Because it will be fairly inconvenient for folks who are only paying cash on board to now need to go to a ticket vending machine to do that, or retail, when you look at those networks. Looking over at the cities, it's a bit complex to tease things out in general. If you kind of squint, I mean, Denver and Gresham kind of basically have the same income disparities. Eugene is a bit different. There's a little bit slightly different pattern, but I'm not going to spend time. You can look at those, and we'll load the slides later for you to look at more closely. But I think the punchline is really that some of these disparities are not going to follow what we find from these three cities in your region, that it's going to take some understanding of your specific riders to understand some of the dimensions of exclusion in your system. When we look at unbanked and the other dimensions of exclusion, the second table, we just kind of focus on the composite table. You can see the high income, if you just look at the green, the high income riders are much better equipped to transition to automated payment systems. You can see they're less likely to be unbanked, less likely to not have a smartphone or lack internet, or only rely on Wi-Fi. They're less likely to they're more likely to use data on their phone. They're still very concerned about data limits, but we think there's a kind of an age effect here, because our older respondents were, anyway, we'll get to age in a moment. They are more likely to transition to the new payment systems, we can see. Sorry, this is discomfort. So they were slightly less uncomfortable using the new payment systems. So they were less uncomfortable using websites, less uncomfortable using and storing their financial information on websites or smartphones. But they were still, they're a bit concerned about paying over by phone compared to the low-income riders. Then when we look at what folks would do without cash on board, and our high-income riders are much more willing or able to switch over to credit or debit-based payments, and were less likely to claim that they would be continuing to rely on cash in the future, and were less likely to claim that they would not be able to ride anymore. So these disparities, I think, are not surprising. They go along, with income. They have better access to all of these services, and are able to use the new fare payment systems. When we look at the cities, it's a little bit muddled. I mean, if you kind of look at some of the red, you do see a lot of red in the low income categories, and compared to the green in the high income groups. And so they're going to be more likely excluded in different ways in each city, depending on, the characteristics of those riders, but some interesting disparities. Next, I want to look at the race and ethnicity groups and look at some disparities there. If we look over At the composite, we actually don't see a lot of disparity. There's slight disparities, but they're not as significant in value as in the income disparities. So we have slight differences in cash payment between our riders of color and our white riders. You can see a higher reliance on cash, but the difference is not as much as by income. We can look at some of the new payment technologies down here, and they're actually fairly similar in terms of smartphone use and credit debit based payment. And so it's just an interesting result. I think across the cities, I think the differences are not quite as great as the income-based differences. But there are some alarming differences here. We see pretty stark difference in cash on bus in Denver, similarly in Eugene and in Portland, Gresham. Smartphone app use is a bit different. Yeah, so some interesting differences there. When we look at the dimensions of exclusion, again, focusing on the composite rider, again, we don't have a lot. I mean, there are some disparities here, but they're not as high as in the income-based disparities. We have the banking access is actually quite different, but when we look at smartphone, internet, and dependence on Wi-Fi, it is fairly similar between our riders of color and our white riders. When we look at smartphone access, so our data use is actually higher among our riders of color, although there is a higher concern about data limitations in their cell data plans. When we look down at discomfort using emerging payment systems, it's actually fairly equal between our two groups. Then we look at future practices without cash on board. We do see our white riders more likely to transition to credit and debit than our riders of color, and our riders of color a bit more dependent on cash, but a similar rate responding that they would not be able to ride. And so I think the race and ethnicity disparities are not quite as alarming. There are some that are significant, but it's interesting to notice that. And then there's some differences among the cities, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. I think it's hard to understand some of those dynamics, but yeah, you can kind of glance and they're a little bit jumbled up with some, disparities showing white riders at a slight disadvantage in Denver. But yeah, interesting results. Let me move to age. So here we have our 3 age groups and then our missing age category with the substantial number of people who did not respond to the age group. Age question. So let's just look at the composite results. And we do have some disparities in payment types, for example, employer-based. Interesting, millennials were more likely to have employer-provided passes. We wonder if this was related to school-based passes, but we did our work in Eugene in the summer, and so we didn't have that many students, but we still might have caught a lot of students in that. But when we look at cash on board, the millennials were more likely to pay cash on board. Look at cash at TVMs, they were also more likely. They were much less likely to go to agency offices or retail with cash, which is interesting. And millennials were more likely to adopt smartphone apps where they were available. And so that was interesting, and less likely to use the agency and retail network for payment. So those are some interesting disparities, not super surprising. The baby boomers were pretty reliant on cash and less, well, they're fairly reliant on credit retail, but we can kind of see some disparities here in smartphone use, which is kind of what we were hearing at the focus groups. But there's some interesting relationships here. And similarly in the three cities. But again, there's a lot of different disparities to look at here, and I'm not going to spend that time because I think I'm running over. Sorry, so almost at the end. Okay. Disparities by age in terms of looking at some of the dimensions of exclusion. Let me just summarize really quick. Our boomers fare worse in terms of potential exclusion from these new payment systems. We see significant lacking of smartphones, internet access, reliance on Wi-Fi, no data use on their phones, much more concern about these new payment systems storing information online on their phones, and much more likely to rely on cash in the future. So and less likely to move to credit. And so we're concerned about those dimensions of exclusion. So let me move to some punchlines. So transit riders are similarly resourced to the general population in terms of some of these new digital resources, but there's still significant barriers for some current transit riders. A significant number, about 30%, still rely heavily on paying cash on buses. And most appear able to switch to other cash or non-cash options, but a significant number claim they will continue to use cash in the future. Overall, smartphone ownership is very high, over 80% for all groups other than the baby boomers. But a significant number are worried about monthly data limits and rely on Wi-Fi, on public Wi-Fi for their internet connectivity. And a small but significant number have no access to formal banking systems. So that's not surprising. We knew that from the general research, but it poses a problem for moves to completely automated payment systems. Finally, there's a general unease with storing credit information, websites, and smartphones. And there's some really interesting and troubling disparities. Low-income respondents had lower access to smartphones, internet, and banking, or older respondents had significantly lower access to smartphones and internet. But some of these disparities varied from city to city. So some implications for practice. The age and income related exclusion was the most troubling. Local conditions seem to vary from city to city, so we really would recommend you doing work with your riders on these issues. Education and training could be important for lowering anxiety to using these new systems. Public Wi-Fi may be a really important link for many users to become more part of these new systems. And we have to question whether free or subsidized smartphones would make sense to try and bridge that gap, especially for our older riders who don't use smartphones. It's a big dimension of exclusion. So let me transition to our questions. Sorry, I went really long. So hopefully there's some questions.
Hi, Aaron. Yes, thank you so much. We do have some questions here.
Oh, awesome. Thanks.
Let's see.
And I'll keep my screen shared in case I need to go back in.
That's perfect. Our first question is up here. Was there any qualitative work done, focus groups, in-person surveys to illustrate reasons why the share of individuals who are using cash would not be able to switch?
Oh, the why question. Yes. I think it was just this general, I think the why is a little bit in the distrust. It wasn't a limitation on the person's ability to use the new systems. It was this recurring concern around losing the account value, hacking, losing privacy in terms of tracking. So there wasn't kind of mechanical reasons people wanted to remain in cash. It was just this lack of trust of the new systems. And that definitely was uncovered in the focus group. It wasn't as easy. The why questions are not as easy in the large sample surveys. So, yeah.
Thank you. Second question is overall, were there more men or women in the sample? Is this representative of ridership in the area?
Yeah, so I did quickly glance over the gender question, and it was about half men and then split among those not answering and female and then other categories. So it was a heavy male sample. I didn't compare that to the general transit ridership, but I should go back and look at that to see if it was a bit overrepresented. But we tried using our sampling strategy, our intercept strategy, to randomly approach riders, so there wasn't hopefully any systematic exclusion of riders in terms of our survey method. Yeah.
Okay. Third question, if cash on board becomes prohibitively expensive, what would the most effective mitigation measure be for its discontinuation?
Well, that is actually what we're moving to now. So thanks for asking that. That's the second part of our project, is really utilizing the survey data we have. We can understand who is still going to rely on some of those cash infrastructure. We get a number of riders, and then we can actually, based on unit costs of continuing to provide those ticket vending machine or cash collectors on board, we can estimate the actual cost per rider and get a cost effectiveness. And that's what we're moving to this summer. We're not complete that work, but that's our goal, is to understand, is it cheaper to kind of issue free smart cards or smartphones than continue with some of these cash collection systems? So that's our next part of our project.
Great. And our last question that we'll have time for is on the payment methods. Do any of these cities offer online payment? I see that in later discussions, but not in the original listing of payment methods.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't really go over all of the payment availability, and they did differ by city. So I know that Denver and Portland, Gresham, and TriMet do have online-based payment. I know that Eugene and Lane Transit does differ slightly, and I don't want to say that they do have online, but I sorry that I can't answer that. Now, our researchers down in Lane in Eugene did modify our survey to tailor it to the options available at LTD. So those hopefully were correct in terms of the options given. And in the tables I just showed, if it was not available, I actually put NA. So I do believe that there might have been some web-based, but maybe not, because they don't have, yeah. So sorry about that. But we had a team down in Eugene handling that. So hopefully it was accurate. Yeah.
Great. Well, just a reminder to our audience that we'll give Aaron and John opportunities to respond to any questions that weren't answered later via email.
Yeah.
And
do email me if you have any other follow-up. Yes, I'm easy to find online, or yeah.
Great. Well, with that pretty much concludes our seminar for today. If you would like to visit more events, you can find those on our website. You can also contact us at asktrek@pdx.edu, and when you close your window, a brief survey is going to pop up. It just takes like a minute or two to complete, and if you could do that, we'd appreciate your feedback. So thank you, Aaron. Thank you, John. He was here helping answer questions. Thank you both very much.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Today.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone for attending.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah. See you later. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.